Hello, and welcome to my channel. Thank you so much for being here. In this video, we're going to discuss who really controls the United States economy. We'll look at some facts, data, and news headlines that show how the central bank impacts our everyday lives, whether we realize it or not. You will be surprised at what you learn. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe. We've been repeatedly told that the Federal Reserve is a quasi-governmental institution, which technically is correct. It was created by Congress, but it's not part of the government. And as such, it doesn't have to follow the rules that all other government agencies have to follow. It is not bound by the Freedom of Information Act, for example. So the Fed is run by private shareholders, yet it's responsible for controlling the United States economy. In fact, it is one of only two entities globally that can print money. The other entity is the US government. So what exactly does it do? What is its purpose? Does it work in the best interests of the American people, or does it serve other interests? Those are extremely important questions. So let's take a look at the main functions of the Fed. The first function is setting monetary policy. Simply put, the Fed sets interest rates that all other banks have to follow. So when the Fed raises interest rates, every bank in the United States raises their interest rates. When the Fed lowers interest rates, all other banks lower their interest rates as well. This means that the Fed effectively controls the cost of borrowing for both businesses and consumers. When interest rates are low, it's cheaper for businesses to borrow money, so they expand, hire more employees, and so do consumers. They take out mortgages, car loans, and finance their everyday purchases. Low interest rates also make it less expensive for governments to borrow money. So when interest rates are low, the economy tends to grow faster because of increased consumer and business spending. On the flip side, high interest rates slow down the economy, make it more expensive for consumers to borrow money, so they cut back on spending, which in turn affects production levels and employment numbers. High interest rates may be good to control inflation, but they tend to be bad for economic growth. The second function of the Fed is quantitative easing. What is quantitative easing? Well, quantitative easing is essentially an injection of cash into the markets. Ever since the financial crisis of 2008, the Fed has been injecting trillions of dollars into the markets with the stated goal of propping up the markets and the banking system. Here's what we need to understand. The Fed doesn't have any money of its own. It simply creates digital money out of thin air. Let me repeat this. The Fed doesn't have any money of its own. It simply creates digital money out of thin air. The Fed then buys financial assets from commercial banks, giving them cash in return. Where does that cash come from? Well, it comes from thin air. The Fed just creates it. By purchasing these financial assets, the Fed puts money directly into the banking system. In addition to that, the Fed keeps interest rates low, so that banks don't charge each other high interest rates for lending money to each other. As a result, banks have plenty of cheap money to lend. In addition to that, thanks to the low interest rates, consumers have cheap access to credit. The Fed essentially tells banks, we're not going to charge you high interest rates for the money that you keep in your reserve accounts. Go ahead and lend it out. Consumers, you have cheap access to credit. Go ahead and take out those mortgages, auto loans, personal loans, and finance your everyday purchases. All of this is done to achieve the stated goals of the Fed: maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. Okay, so you might be thinking, why should I care about the Fed? Why is it relevant to me? Let's take a look at this headline from CNBC. Federal Reserve raises interest rates again. How will this impact inflation? Another one from the Wall Street Journal. God. Big Tech now accounts for over 25% of the S&P 500's total value. Big tech companies rely on borrowed money to fund their operations. Think about Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple. These companies wouldn't be where they are today if it wasn't for cheap access to credit. And when big tech does well, average investors in the stock market do well as well. Investors buy stocks in big tech companies because they know that these companies will continue to grow. That's why even though big tech companies don't pay dividends, investors still buy their stocks. A recent example of this is Tesla. In 2022, Tesla lost nearly 90% of its value. Yet in January of 2023, Tesla shares soared 14% after the company said that it would cut prices in order to boost demand. Because investors believe that Tesla will grow faster than all other automakers. So the Fed's actions directly affect stock values, and by extension, investors' portfolios. That's why it's critical to understand the role of the Fed in our economy. Let's take a look at this article from the New York Times. Lobbying spending hits record $4.1 billion. Who's pulling the strings in Washington? According to this article, lobbying spending hit a record $4.1 billion in 2022. Who are the biggest spenders? You guessed it, big corporations. Nearly half of all the money spent on lobbying came from just 20 companies. 3 of the top 5 spenders are banks: Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Citigroup. Lobbying is essentially legalized bribery. So the banks lobby lawmakers to look after their interests. But who exactly are these big banks serving? Are they serving the best interests of their shareholders, their customers, or themselves? Well, unfortunately, the evidence suggests that the big banks serve themselves. Banks don't benefit their customers. After all, they charge customers high fees for services while giving their own shareholders huge discounts. For example, the largest U.S. banks received $75 billion in emergency government funds during the 2008 financial crisis. At the same time, they were charging customers high fees for basic services. Customers were getting nickel and dimed, while the banks were receiving billions in bailout money. Now, let's take a look at this article from the BBC. What does this mean for the economy? BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street are investment management companies. They manage the money of pension funds, retirement accounts, and mutual funds. Essentially, these companies manage the money of everyday Americans. However, according to this article, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street now control nearly $20 trillion in assets. To put that number in perspective, the entire GDP of the United States is around $26 trillion. So these 3 companies alone control a significant portion of the U.S. economy. In fact, these 3 companies control more money than the GDP of every single developing country in the world combined. So who exactly are these companies accountable to? Well, unfortunately, there is reason to believe that these companies may not be serving the best interests of their clients. There is a very real possibility that they are serving their own interests. To avoid future crises, the IMF recommended increasing regulation of the banks and making them more accountable to their shareholders. Unfortunately, Congress didn't heed this advice. Instead, Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, ironically made the banks even less accountable to their shareholders. Under the guise of protecting consumers, big banks are now allowed to engage in proprietary trading. Proprietary trading is essentially gambling with customers' money. Despite the risks, the banks were explicitly prohibited from engaging in proprietary trading. This is precisely what the IMF warned Congress not to do. By allowing the banks to engage in proprietary trading, Congress gave the banks the green light to gamble with customers' money. And guess what? It worked. In the first quarter of 2014, JP Morgan Chase made $1.5 billion in profits from proprietary trading. Goldman Sachs made $1.1 billion, and Bank of America made $689 million. The point here is that there is clear evidence that the banks are serving their own interests, not the interests of their customers. And when it comes to the Federal Reserve, well, it's no different. It is no coincidence that the Fed bails out big banks, big corporations, and large investment funds like hedge funds, while millions of ordinary Americans suffer. So who really controls the United States economy? Well, it's not the government. The Fed isn't accountable to anyone. It serves the interests of the banks, large corporations, and large investment funds. The next time you hear the Fed is a quasi-governmental institution, just remember that although it was created by the government, it doesn't have to follow the rules that all other governmental institutions have to follow. The Fed is run by private shareholders, and it serves their interests, not yours. Thank you for watching this video. Thank you for taking the time. I truly appreciate it. Remember to share this video with friends and family. Subscribe to my channels, and I will see you in my next one tomorrow. Take care.